Are you fulfilled? Can you confidently say that you're living your life with intention? Do you know your own blind spots? Do you make an effort to understand how your psychological experiences have shaped you? If you answered yes to any of these questions, congratulations. I commend you. However, if you answered no, then you should keep watching. The more you live without intention, without investigating your blind spots, without gleaning your psychological underpinnings, then the more you wander through life desultorily. And the more you do this, the less fulfillment you experience, the less freedom and personal autonomy, the less self-control you can exercise to emancipate yourself from our contemporarily prevalent dopamine harvesters, the less you are inclined to forge your own path, to use your challenges to transform who you are, and ultimately to cultivate your individuality, which is one of the very things I intend to encourage through creating these videos. Now, this isn't to create a dismal or dreary depiction of life. It's to act as a reminder to maximize your potential, to cultivate your individuality, and embrace unconventionality. Because indeed, as Carl Jung had said, it is the privilege of a lifetime to become who you truly are. I'm speaking from my own individual experience as a 23-year-old. I'm not intending to proselytize. I'm not intending to preach dogma. This is just what I've learned and what I'm reflecting on, having lived thus far. And I know that there is definitely more to come as my life goes on. Now, you're probably wondering how you can course correct to avoid the bleak picture I just painted. And if you do think this, then I'm glad. The answer is through something presently overlooked, although it is starting to gain traction. And what is this thing? It's gaining conscious and unconscious clarity. As a society, we're really good with the first part, but we're horrible with the last part. Well, what is conscious and unconscious clarity? I'll explain. To understand what it means to gain conscious and unconscious clarity, it depends on our understanding of what consciousness is, as well as what the unconscious is. So I will begin with that. To explain this, I'll be drawing upon a lot of Jungian psychology, as well as the biopsychosocial model propounded by the excellent individuals over at Jung To Live By, particularly Steve and Pauline Richards, as well as James Dowling. As I understand it, consciousness is primarily, and in a psychological model, the ego. Not in the traditional understanding that it's our destructive quality that is associated with pride and grandiosity, but rather it is the center of our awareness. It's where our thoughts and perceptions occur. It is definitely influenced by our persona and self, but perhaps most importantly, our unconscious. And extending this theme of consciousness, the reason why, in my opinion, merely becoming more conscious is insufficient at moving away from the bleak picture I just mentioned is because it fails to accord with psychic homeostasis. What does that mean? Well, you can't rationalize your genomic nudges that encourage you to maximize your potential. These represent attempts for your body and psyche to maintain an appropriate balance according to your genetics, life trajectory, and biology. And obviously, your psychology. Think of the consequences associated with the repression of sexuality and how that may perversely flourish in other realms. However, this practice of rationalization is exactly what these consciousness-driven practices attempt to do. I'll recite a quote from Jung himself, where he states that, "We are so accustomed to the apparently rational nature of our world that we can scarcely imagine anything happening that cannot be explained by common sense or material science. It targets a symptom and never the root cause." Now, what is the root cause? Well, it's what's underneath the iceberg. And this dovetails into my discussion of the unconscious. The unconscious, then, is what slips out of consciousness, either intentionally or unintentionally. It is often the storage center of the emotional associations of what occurs in our conscious perceptions of our daily lives. And this is often characterized as the shadow, or getting closer to more accurate representations, complexes, which are a big thing, and perhaps I might make another video on that later on. But more broadly, they seem to reflect the unconscious as far as I've understood it. So then, much like the bulk of us is comprised of 70% water, or so the saying goes, then much of us is not comprised of consciousness, rather it's comprised of the unconscious. And this makes sense considering that consciousness only has so much bandwidth in terms of attention, focus, information processing, and its collection. And this becomes significant when considering the following quote: "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Carl Jung. So now that we have a better understanding of what consciousness and the unconscious actually are, I hope you can start to see that ideally you want to gain clarity in both. To gain conscious clarity is to cultivate greater self-awareness. For instance, you'd gain greater insight into your behaviors, your mannerisms, the specific words you say, the phrases you say, and how often you say them, what irritates you, what you enjoy, and how your conduct aligns with your purpose. To gain unconscious clarity, then, would be to cultivate holistic self-awareness. For instance, you'd gain a greater understanding of the drivers, emotions, and beliefs that are underpinning those very behaviors, mannerisms, and common phrases. You'd gain a greater insight into why something irritates you, or why you enjoy something. So ultimately, cultivating both will better position you to answer yes to the questions I asked you at the beginning of this video. With regards to question 1, you can better live with intention, because through understanding who it is you are, you can directly exclude anything that isn't related to your path or life trajectory. And with regards to the second, you can navigate through life better through understanding how your blind spots have influenced or continue to influence your decision making. And even identifying your blind spots to begin with is already a significant step forward. And with regards to the third, you can ultimately better maximize your potential and cultivate greater individuality through understanding the psychological experiences and their associated emotional impact, and ultimately how they have shaped you, or perhaps continue to shape you. Now, how do we practically go about gaining conscious and unconscious clarity? Brilliant question. Insofar as I've discovered, the best way is to establish a respectful dialogue between yourself and the unconscious. Jung described it as active imagination. And in practical terms and in everyday methods, a lot of the ways that people do so are through creative pursuits. And this includes, although it isn't exhaustive by any measure, books, films, plays, and music. For instance, Charlotte Bronte's novels, such as Jane Eyre, were her method of establishing a creative dialogue between herself and her father complex. And the reason I've mentioned Charlotte Bronte is because I was reading a paper by Lisa Marchiano, if I've pronounced that correctly, where she discusses this. And relatedly, I'd like to mention a quote. Charlotte Bronte's novels allowed her to live into her complexes, to have an exchange with her wounded inner masculine, to find the inner nurturing feminine, and to claim her feminine shadow through some of her dark female characters. That encapsulates perfectly the way with which an individual can establish a respectful dialogue creatively and eventually, if done correctly, overcome the things that may have been holding them back psychologically. And so I found that paper quite illuminating. And if you wanted to check that out, I've linked it down below. And the other reason that I've read it is because it's part of my own journey in better understanding the feminine and in cultivating greater relationships. However, the title of this video should still be lingering in your heads, considering I haven't mentioned journaling yet. So, I will share a method that's benefited me. I find this method rewarding in conjunction to others, such as music and film, because I enjoy revealing the sculpture of myself from the marble of my experience through the tool that is the written word. And that method is, you guessed it, journaling. Now you might be thinking, hold on. Journaling, that silly thing you do for 10 minutes where you write what happened in your day and merely scribe events. To that, I'm trying to be polite here. I would respectfully say no. To elaborate, I'll explain what journaling is not for those who want to receive the most value from their reflections. So, as we've established, most conceptions of journaling are ill-informed. It is not a dear diary, and for all appeals to the divine. It is not just about mindfulness. Let me elaborate a bit on this mindfulness point, because I think it's worthy of it. Gaining a greater appreciation for the moment is great. And if that's helped you thus far, that's fantastic. Although remember that it is a respite from the stresses of conscious life. So it eases your physiology. But mindfulness doesn't even remotely touch the person that is watching this video. You. Your complexes, your life trajectory, your unconscious elements. You may argue that it provides a space for them to come to fruition, and that's fantastic. But can you remember what occurred 2 years ago on October 26th at 12 p.m. without any method of transcription and appropriate reflection? The answer is likely no. So, what I just mentioned is exactly what you discover through journaling insofar as how I do it. So to actually understand you, your complexes, your life trajectory, your unconscious elements, and everything related to maximizing your potential, that is what you can establish through journaling, and journaling long enough, as well as through my approaches that I'm going to mention just in a minute, as they'll ultimately better position you to gain conscious and unconscious clarity. I'd also like to touch on the notion of self-improvement. I've mentioned that I am interested in the realm of self-improvement and self-development. However, with regards to self-improvement, I'd like to clarify something through the lens of journaling. Journaling as an activity, particularly the way that I practice it, is substantially different from its portrayals in the often superficial self-improvement groups. Such proponents tend to focus on outward behaviors, which indeed yield external or outward-facing results. For instance, a better body, a cleaner workspace, productivity, and a clearer mind. But they rarely touch the inner world, which is the very thing that influences our external results. And drawing upon what I just listened to in a podcast by Jung To Live By, it's also because it fails to reflect the fact that rather than self-improving, you need to psychosocially adapt better. And you do that through identifying where you are maladapted and what your instincts are telling you. And how do you find that out? Well, you guessed it, journaling. Now, to tantalize you even further, I'd like to mention why you should even bother journaling if you're sitting on the fence about it. In addition to gaining greater conscious and unconscious clarity, and ultimately aiming to answer yes to the questions I posed to you at the beginning of this video, journaling is a physical process which brings you closer to using your psychology as a transformative experience. By understanding yourself better, it brings you closer to actualizing your ideal self. And that's really important, especially in light of this channel, because it ultimately allows you to better maximize your potential. As an aside, the idea of using your psychology as a transformative experience is a sentiment that was well expressed by Bud Harris. He did so in a book I've just completed reading, which I'll link below. And in that book, he effectively stated that complexes aren't trying to destroy you. Now, while I've used the term complexes, they more broadly reflect how you've adapted to experiences that you've lived through, and what emotions are associated with those adaptations. And therefore, I'd like to add that you can't blame your body and your psyche from adapting to ensure your survival. And as Harris rightly notes, considering they're not trying to destroy you, they're actually there as potential transformative experiences. And that point is also reflected in Marciano's exploration of how Charlotte Bronte's novels allowed her to transform herself through working with her father complex, which ultimately culminated. Funny that that just happened. That is my reminder to journal from day one. I'll get to that shortly. As I was saying, that point is also reflected in Marciano's paper, where she discusses Charlotte Bronte, particularly because through working with her father complex, it ultimately culminated in a transformation, which was her marriage. But it isn't just Marciano or Charlotte Bronte. An excellent story that was extracted from a book, I believe, from C.S. Lewis, involved a ghost and a lizard that sat on his shoulder. I won't spoil it, but it was extracted in the book by Harris, which I've linked below. I found that fascinating. I digress. One of the other things you might be wondering is, but why? Why not just remain in the blissful state of ignorance? Why even bother gaining a greater understanding of yourself? It's easier, it requires less effort, and I've done pretty well where I am right now, so why even bother investing all that time? I can still achieve what I want consciously. To that, I'd say, sure, you can. But you can't eradicate something in you. Those things are your genomic nudges. I know the term might make it seem clandestine or arcane, but trust me, it's not. Your genomic nudges are you, or more accurately, your potential. When you feel dissatisfied because you chose the instant gratification route, or you chose a behavior that you know is likely to lead to short-term pleasure, but not long-term satisfaction, or you feel unfulfilled or worried about the future because you haven't planned appropriately, or in comparison to others, you realize that you're not perhaps as well off as you thought you would be. Or in synthesizing all of those things, you might have small realizations that others are actualizing their ideal self and maximizing their potential while you're not. And your body gives you slight nudges to remind you of that. Those are your genomic nudges. So, indeed, you can remain in a blissful state of ignorance. But you would be doing a formidable disservice to yourself, your potential self, and your genetic legacy. Now, the time has come to understand how to appropriately journal. So I will explain. The recommendations that I'm about to make are made in certain stages, and those correspond with an individual's level of development. So I've suggested 2 different approaches, and I'll explain each one respectively. Now let's begin with approach 1. This approach is simplistic enough to allow for conscious development and self-awareness. I haven't touched the unconscious yet because you need to become accustomed to this first. Now it involves responding to 3 questions. The first, what did I achieve / what went well? The second, what didn't I achieve / what didn't go so well? And the third is, what can I improve? Now this might sound very simple, and that's good. Because remember, to gain the value is ultimately through developing a consistent journaling habit. This is especially important when you retroactively attempt to better understand yourself because you'll have more data to rely on. You'll have more data to see the patterns in your thought processes and the behaviors or emotions that you've written about. Also, this approach still places a significant emphasis on the maximization of potential through the improvement section. But Jad, how do I know what can be improved? And that's a valid question. So I'm going to offer you some tips in relation to that. To understand what conduct to improve, you have to compare your current conduct with the conduct of your ideal self. And then you ask yourself, did you move in the direction of actualizing that ideal self? If not, then what could you have done to move in that direction? Now don't make it abstruse or grandiose. Start small. Here's an example. You're looking to meet new people, or develop new friends, or meet like-minded business people, for instance. So you attend events to meet new people. When it comes time to introduce yourself, you say your name and immediately go for a handshake. However, you haven't obtained the person's name. So an awkward exchange of value takes place, especially in terms of demonstrating professionalism and your own value. So an improvement would have been to ask for their name first, and if they seem receptive to you as an individual, then going for a handshake. Ultimately, this can correspond with your ideal self as being socially calibrated. Now let me clarify something important. This isn't to mean that through journaling, you're crafting yourself as some inherent hero that you can't relate to, and one that is solely and completely focused on perpetual improvement. Absolutely not, because to do so will not allow you to appreciate your progress. It is, however, an opportunity for you to be encouraged to recognize and pursue excellence through better understanding yourself. So therefore, the process would make a noble result of getting you closer to your ideal self. So, let's discuss approach 2 now. This approach builds on the former, but a precondition to using this approach is that you're now more consistent. You're slightly more self-aware. So now this approach factors in your psychology, and it's now where you begin engaging in a respectful dialogue with your unconscious. Now this is important. Do not beat yourself up for your own personal, private self-expression. If you don't respect the unconscious, it won't respect you, and in doing so, it won't cooperate with you. So considering that this approach builds on the former, it involves answering 2 more questions. The first additional question is, how did my emotions color my reactions or behaviors today? For example, when X said this or did this, I observed that I felt angry or envious, or I lashed out in response to this. This would better reflect an understanding of your complexes as well. You might be able to identify them there. But importantly, when you see that you've done things such as lashing out, or you've had considerable affect or emotion in a particular experience, you should note that. Now, in me saying this as a guy, especially in contemporary developed societies, the idea of understanding your emotions is somehow considered weak. And to be honest, that used to be me. I used to brush that off as something not worth paying attention to. However, when you realize the value that comes from understanding yourself and using your emotions as signals for areas that you can better understand yourself, then the real value comes from being able to use that knowledge to improve yourself and, perhaps even more importantly, your relationships. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter the amount of money, the material possessions, it all comes back to relationships and to people. And I've learned that, and I'm continually reminded about that. So the next time you encounter a cultural guru who criticizes you for emotional understanding, please think twice and use your critical analysis skills to understand what it actually means to be a human and contextualize that statement. This is different to acting on every emotion. That is a completely different thing, and in fact it isn't necessarily recommended. But better understanding yourself through using your emotions as signals is indeed valuable. Now the second additional question is, what underlying beliefs or repressed ideas might these suggest? If I was to give an example, there are certain layers to this. There's layer 1, layer 2, and it goes on. And in me doing this, for instance, I've noticed that the more I write, the deeper into the layers of understanding I go. For instance, watch how in this example, I gradually progress in depth through the layers of understanding. One of the underlying beliefs that might have come to fruition in reflection is that they're doing something I'm not, or they're doing something that I feel incapable of, second layer. Deeper than that, it may reflect that having seen someone actualize their ideal self, you feel incapable of doing so because of an internalized victim mindset that you've inherited from your mother, for instance. And this is a common one I've seen amongst the girls. Don't ask me how. But you see that delving into the layers of depth better reflects the unconscious and repressed elements of yourself. Now, this isn't to say that I'm expecting you to articulate yourself like I have, or to use the terms that I have, because to do so would require an understanding, even a cursory one, of the terms that I've just mentioned, such as a victim mindset or inheriting things from parents. So to complement your journaling, I would encourage you reading into the fields of psychology, because you'd be able to relate to other people's examples and use that knowledge to improve your own self-awareness, both consciously and unconsciously. So through this approach integrating the first, you then have a system for greater cultivating self-awareness, because you're now acknowledging opposite yet complementary forces, consciousness and the unconscious. And through reflecting upon them, you therefore gain clarity. Now, to simplify the process for you, and if you weren't already aware, I use an application called Day 1 for my journaling. I've created a template for Day 1 which incorporates the questions I've just mentioned and practically allows you to copy and paste them into a template so that every time you journal a new entry, those questions appear for you without having to rewrite them every single time. You can download that template by clicking the link in the description, and I've attached instructions on how to load those questions into a template into day one. Now, I've also linked in the description my other resources, such as my Multifaceted Planner, which is a Notion-based weekly planner that is practically more than a planner. It incorporates the ideas of actualizing your ideal self and maximizing your potential, but importantly, breaking them down into the tasks every week and every day that you must do to get there. Importantly, the planner also acknowledges the value of reflection. And this is because it has a separate section dedicated to reviewing your week, what happened during the week, what went off course, what has been left unattended that you should attend to next week, what went well, what didn't go well, all within the same planner so that it's all streamlined. So that brings us to the end of this video. And in keeping with the tradition of my other videos, I'll end with a quote. I've already said it, but it's worth saying again. It is the privilege of a lifetime to become who you truly are.